So Jeffrey wants to know, how do I make that kind of smoff animations? Now I assume that what Jeffrey really means is smooth animations. However, due to my immaturity, I will be saying smoff throughout the rest of this video. Now, there's plenty of ways to make an animation more smoff. However, for this video, I do just want to talk about a very simple thing I do to actually achieve a smoffer look. And that's just adding more frames to the animation. So here's an example, 2 versions of the same animation. Now, what is the core difference between these two? Well, it's just the number of frames and the speed of which they render. The animation on the right here is only running at 10 frames at 10 frames per second, and the animation on the left here is running at 20 frames at 20 frames per second. So it's double the frames and double the speed, which is what gives it this smoffer look. And to that you may think, oh, 20 frames instead of 10 frames, that's going to be double the work. I'm going to have to draw twice as many frames. And to that I say, not necessarily. If we take a look at this original animation, the 10 frame one, this is where my starting point was. This is what I produced before moving on to this one over here. And this acted as a sufficient foundation to then move on to making this animation. In other words, I could use these frames down here which already exist, and just by duplicating every single frame, for instance taking this frame here, duplicating it, moving on to the next frame, duplicating it, and so on, all the way until I get to 20 frames, I could pretty much do that, and then every second frame do some kind of tweak, move it slightly closer to the next position, and then I wouldn't have to redraw another 10 frames. And so in this case I've got this frame which is a duplicate of this frame before, and we've got this frame coming afterwards. So I can just take the duplicate of this frame. As a basic example, I could just move this sword up, then move the arm up a bit, and then as we can see the head's got a bit of distance here, so we can just move this up to get a bit closer. And then we've got this leg over here, so we can bring that down. And we've got this nose which goes up, so we can take this, bring that up. And we need to move this mouth. And maybe we just move this arm down a bit. You get the idea. I'm not actually redrawing everything, but really I'm just moving bits around with a selection tool and just moving different parts of the sprite to match the next frame. And then if I do this process for every single one of these frames, then we eventually end up with something more like this one, which is a bit smoother. Well, it's twice as smooth. And that's my typical approach for making things smoother. I don't actually go through the effort of redrawing every single frame, but instead I start out with these core 10 frames, and then I use these ones which already exist, duplicating them, and then making slight adjustments to fill in the gaps between the frame, to which I then eventually highlight them all, go into frame properties and set it to 50. I'd cut the duration of the frame in half, which is essentially doubling the FPS, and so it would go from 10 frames per second to 20 frames per second, eventually leaving us with this. Now it's important to note at the end of all this that the one on the left isn't objectively better. It may look nicer, it may look smoother and less choppy, but there are many occasions and there are many people who will have a preference, let's say a stylistic preference, towards something that looks more like this, and that's fine. In fact, some people will go even slower than this, just to try and get a certain look. And we could do that very quickly. So maybe if I just took every second frame away, and then I double the duration of the frames, and then we get something a bit more like that. Personally, I'm not a fan, but again, it all depends on what you're trying to achieve. But if your goal is to achieve something more like that, well then I would suggest doing the things which I've mentioned in this video. Or maybe you want to get even smoother, you want things to look even faster, in which case all you've got to do is just follow this process of taking every frame, duplicating it, and just filling in the gaps more and more and upping the FPS more and more. Hopefully that all made sense. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to ask. But other than that, I will see you when I see ya.